Right now, as you listen to these words, the United States Navy is preparing to execute a geopolitical maneuver it has not attempted in decades. It is a terrifying, unprecedented move that is currently reshaping the global economy, completely rewriting the established rules of international shipping, and threatening to send global energy prices through the roof. The 47th President of the United States has just authorized a full, uncompromising naval blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. If you do not fully comprehend what the Strait of Hormuz is or why it dictates the fate of empires, trust me, by the end of this deep dive, you will understand exactly why every single nation on Earth is watching this naval standoff unfold with absolute, unadulterated terror. Let us break this down completely because the mainstream media is only feeding you panicked, fragmented headlines. We are going to give you the comprehensive, terrifying tactical picture. The fuse for this global crisis was lit over the weekend on Saturday, April 11th, 2026. The Vice President of the United States was sitting in a heavily secured room in Islamabad, Pakistan. He was leading a high-stakes, incredibly tense American diplomatic delegation that included special envoys and senior strategic advisors. Sitting directly across the table from them were the highest-ranking Iranian and Pakistani negotiators. The goal of this summit was simple in concept but monumental in execution. Find a permanent end to the devastating multi-domain war between the United States and Iran, a kinetic conflict that violently erupted back on February 28th when the United States and Israel launched a massive, decapitating air campaign against the Iranian mainland. For more than 21 agonizing hours, these two opposing sides sat in that room and negotiated. 21 hours, that is almost an entire day of non-stop, grueling, high-stakes diplomatic warfare. And according to the American administration, most of the secondary points of conflict were actually agreed upon. There was genuine, tangible progress being made toward a lasting ceasefire. But there was one single massive issue. One insurmountable roadblock that blew the entire peace process completely apart: nuclear weapons. The Iranian delegation absolutely refused to surrender their highly enriched uranium stockpiles or dismantle their subterranean nuclear centrifuges. For the American administration, that was the ultimate red line. It was the one strategic factor that absolutely could not and would not be compromised. The American leadership stated plainly that the nuclear issue was the only point that truly mattered for the long-term security of the region, and Iran was entirely unyielding about preserving its nuclear program. So the diplomatic talks collapsed in spectacular fashion. The American delegation packed their briefcases, abandoned the negotiating table, and immediately flew out of Pakistan. And then, on Sunday morning, April 12th, the President of the United States published a digital message that sent absolute shockwaves rippling through every major capital and financial market around the globe. The Commander-in-Chief declared that, effective immediately, the United States Navy would begin heavily blockading any and all commercial or military ships attempting to enter or leave the Strait of Hormuz. He issued a direct, uncompromising order to the United States Fifth Fleet to actively seek out and physically interdict every single vessel operating in international waters that was found to have paid an extortion toll to the Iranian government. He ordered the American military to aggressively begin hunting and destroying the thousands of naval sea mines that Iran had laid across the narrow waterway, and he ended the broadcast with a chilling, unmistakable warning. Any Iranian asset, whether it be a fast attack boat, a coastal missile battery, or a drone swarm that attempts to fire upon American warships or peaceful commercial vessels, will be met with overwhelming, disproportionate, and utterly devastating kinetic force. We need to pause right here, because to truly grasp the gravity of this military escalation, you must understand the geography of the battlefield. What exactly is the Strait of Hormuz, and why does this single stretch of water hold the entire planet hostage? The Strait of Hormuz is a remarkably narrow, incredibly treacherous maritime choke point nestled between the coastlines of Iran to the north and Oman to the south. It is the only physical waterway connecting the energy-rich Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman and subsequently to the open ocean of the Arabian Sea. At its absolute narrowest point, this strait is only 21 miles wide. But through this tiny, highly congested maritime artery flows roughly 20% of the entire world's global oil supply. We are talking about the continuous movement of approximately 21 million barrels of crude oil every single day. Furthermore, roughly 20% of the entire planet's liquefied natural gas also passes through this exact same channel. Sovereign nations and global economic powerhouses like Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, and Qatar absolutely depend on this specific strait to get their energy resources to the global market. Think about the sheer scale of that vulnerability. One-fifth of all the oil on the planet must squeeze through a stretch of dark water that is significantly narrower than the English Channel. If that waterway gets shut down or becomes an active military kill zone, the entire global economy feels the shockwave instantly. And I mean absolutely everyone, from the local gas station down the street from your house to the massive manufacturing plants in China to the critical winter heating systems across Europe. Since the kinetic war officially started in late February of 2026, the Iranian military has been forcefully controlling this critical strait. They have been aggressively using it as their ultimate geopolitical leverage. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps naval forces essentially transformed the world's busiest shipping lane into a heavily armed, militarized toll booth. Commercial supertankers were forced to submit full, intrusive documentation to Iranian authorities, beg for clearance codes, and accept a heavily armed Iranian naval escort through a single, tightly controlled transit corridor. Some international shipping companies were being forced to pay up to $2 million in extortion fees just to secure safe passage for a single voyage, and Iran was highly selective, playing geopolitical favorites about who was actually allowed to pass. Chinese ships, Indian ships, and Pakistani ships were being granted transit, but dozens of other international vessels were being aggressively turned away or forced to wait indefinitely in the open water. Before this conflict erupted, an average of 130 massive commercial vessels transited the Strait of Hormuz every single day. By the time the American blockade was officially announced, that number had plummeted to fewer than 10. Over 3,200 massive commercial vessels were hopelessly stranded on the western side of the strait, physically unable to navigate out of the Persian Gulf. Colossal oil tankers, fully loaded to the brim with millions of barrels of crude oil, were just sitting idle in the water, waiting for a diplomatic miracle. The situation was already a global economic crisis long before the American announcement. But now it has evolved into a hyper-lethal military standoff. You might be wondering about the underlying strategy here, because on the surface, this American maneuver seems inherently contradictory. The United States has been demanding that Iran open the strait. They have been demanding free, unimpeded passage for all international shipping. So why would the American military now establish a blockade on the exact same strait they want completely opened? The answer lies in grand strategy and economic warfare. Iran was having its cake and eating it too. They were keeping the strait mostly closed to Western allies, which was devastating the global economy. Global oil prices had already surged to terrifying levels. At one point during the conflict, physical oil prices hit an unprecedented $150 per barrel. Gasoline prices in the United States effortlessly crossed the $4 a gallon threshold. National inflation jumped to 3.3% in March, completely erasing months of economic recovery. The financial pain was incredibly real, and it was spreading like a virus. But here is the critical, infuriating dynamic that the American administration recognized. While Iran was aggressively restricting the global supply chain, they were still quietly, continuously exporting their own domestic oil through the very strait they were holding hostage. According to satellite tracking and global data analysts, Iran actually managed to export an average of 1.85 million barrels of crude oil per day throughout the month of March. That is incredibly more than they were exporting before the war even began. They were making billions of dollars. They were selling their sanctioned oil at a massive premium to eager buyers in Asia. They were financially profiting off the exact global crisis they had intentionally created. The American naval blockade is specifically designed to violently flip this dynamic. By deploying Arleigh Burke-class destroyers to physically cut off Iran's ability to export its own oil, the United States is attempting to sever Iran's primary economic lifeline. No more selling discounted oil to China. No more collecting multi-million-dollar extortion tolls from passing international ships. No more using the global energy supply as a diplomatic bargaining chip. The American message is absolute and uncompromising. If the democratic world does not get to use the Strait of Hormuz, then the Iranian regime does not get to use it either. United States Central Command issued a clarifying operational directive shortly after the initial announcement. They stated that the naval blockade would be aggressively enforced on all maritime traffic attempting to enter or exit Iranian territorial ports. However, they explicitly added that American naval forces would not impede the freedom of navigation for commercial vessels transiting the Strait to and from non-Iranian ports. So, in strategic theory, this is a surgical blockade targeted exclusively at the Iranian regime. But naval analysts and economic experts know that the practical, real-world effect is a total, absolute closure of the waterway. The Strait has become such a highly volatile, active combat zone that even with explicit American assurances of protection, major global shipping conglomerates are absolutely not going to risk sending their multi-million-dollar vessels and civilian crews into the crossfire. The global insurance markets have already made their decision. Insurance premiums for any commercial ship attempting to transit the Persian Gulf have skyrocketed to mathematically impossible levels. Lloyd's of London and other major maritime underwriters have essentially made it prohibitively expensive to send a tanker through that water. Even if the United States Navy guarantees that non-Iranian ships can pass freely, the thousands of contact mines that Iran has laid in the water, the ever-present threat of swarm attacks by the Revolutionary Guard, and the general, unpredictable chaos of a multi-domain war zone makes it a complete no-go area for commercial operators. The global reaction to this military escalation was immediate and highly fractured. Because this is no longer just an isolated American military operation, this blockade directly impacts the national security and economic survival of literally every single country on the planet. The United Kingdom was incredibly quick to publicly distance itself from the aggressive American blockade. A senior spokesperson for the British government stated that they continue to solely support the freedom of navigation and the immediate peaceful opening of the Strait. They boldly declared that the international waterway must not be subject to extortion or tolling by any nation, and they announced they were actively working with France and other European partners to assemble what they called a wide maritime coalition to protect commercial shipping. Stripped of its diplomatic jargon, the United Kingdom is essentially saying they desperately want the oil to flow, but they are absolutely refusing to assist the United States Navy in enforcing a kinetic blockade against the Iranian mainland. The response from the Iranian government was predictable, aggressive, and fierce. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps immediately issued a broadcast warning that any foreign military vessels attempting to approach their territorial waters or enforce a blockade would be dealt with harshly, decisively, and with overwhelming lethal force. Iran's foreign minister took to the international press, describing the failed Islamabad negotiations as the most intensive, exhaustive engagement between the two hostile nations in 47 years. He claimed that Iran had participated in absolute good faith, but he aggressively accused the American delegation of maximalism, diplomatic arrogance, and constantly shifting the geopolitical goalposts. He called the sudden blockade announcement undeniable evidence that the United States military apparatus had learned absolutely zero lessons from its past interventions in the Middle East. An Iranian lawmaker who was physically present in the negotiating room went even further, delivering a chilling promise to the global press. He stated unequivocally that the Strait of Hormuz will not be opened under American threats. He declared that the world is about to experience an entirely new form of military management in the Strait, implying a massive, asymmetrical escalation. Meanwhile, the global financial markets reacted with pure, unadulterated panic. Brent crude oil, the international benchmark, surged by more than 8% in a matter of minutes, violently crossing the $100 per barrel threshold once again. United States domestic crude futures jumped simultaneously, hitting approximately $105 per barrel. And you must understand, these are not just abstract numbers blinking on a Wall Street terminal. These massive commodity spikes translate directly and immediately into higher prices at your local gas pump, exponentially higher global shipping costs, soaring grocery prices, and a crippling increase in the cost of basic human survival. To truly comprehend the magnitude of this crisis, you have to look at the sheer economic destruction that has already occurred. Since the Iranian military began restricting access to the Strait in early March, the global economy has been brutally severed from roughly 10 million barrels of oil every single day. That is a staggering, almost incomprehensible loss of energy. Massive producing nations like Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates have all been forced to drastically slash their daily oil production because they simply cannot physically get their product to the international market. The massive, sprawling oil storage facilities scattered across the Arabian Peninsula are completely full to the brim. There is literally nowhere left to put the oil, even if they continue to pump it out of the ground. The Dallas Federal Reserve recently published a terrifying economic study indicating that this specific maritime disruption could artificially lower global gross domestic product growth by nearly 3 full percentage points in the second quarter of 2026. Think about the catastrophic reality of that metric. The entire interconnected global economy, representing billions of human lives, slowing down by almost 3% simply because of a 21-mile stretch of contested salt water. And the crisis extends far beyond just crude oil. The Strait of Hormuz is a hypercritical transit corridor for liquefied natural gas, industrial methanol, aluminum, sulfur, and even helium. The small nation of Qatar provides approximately 30% of the entire planet's helium supply, and every single canister of it must be shipped directly through the strait. Helium is a non-negotiable, essential component for advanced semiconductor manufacturing and medical imaging technology, which means this naval standoff is now directly threatening the global technology industry, the artificial intelligence boom, and the global healthcare sector. The nations of Europe are finding themselves particularly uniquely vulnerable to this specific crisis. They were already struggling with dangerously low natural gas storage levels following a brutally harsh winter. The sudden disruption in the Middle East sent European natural gas prices soaring to record highs. The European Central Bank was immediately forced to postpone its highly anticipated planned interest rate cuts, completely stalling their economic recovery. Financial economists are now screaming warnings that the heavily energy-intensive industrial economies of Central Europe could easily tip into a deep, prolonged recession if this naval blockade continues through the summer months. Over in Asia, the geopolitical situation is even more dire. It is bordering on a total societal collapse. Developing nations like the Philippines have been forced to officially declare national states of emergency. Bangladesh, Pakistan, Nigeria, and Vietnam are currently facing severe, crippling domestic fuel shortages. Multiple countries have already implemented draconian fuel rationing protocols just to keep their emergency services operational. The government of the Philippines even resorted to implementing a mandatory temporary 4-day work week for its entire population in a desperate, sweeping attempt to reduce national fuel consumption. Here inside the United States, we are somewhat insulated from the absolute worst of the immediate shockwaves, primarily because we are currently the world's largest domestic oil producer and we are geographically isolated from the epicenter of the kinetic crisis. But we are absolutely not immune. Domestic gasoline prices have already risen by roughly 30% since the air campaign started in February. The federal government has frantically released over 172 million barrels of crude oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve in a desperate attempt to artificially cushion the blow to the American consumer. But the Strategic Petroleum Reserve is not an infinite, magical well. Every single barrel of emergency oil we release right now to fight this price spike is a barrel we will not have available for a future, potentially worse national security emergency. Which brings us to the most critical, terrifying question of all: what exactly happens next? Because this is where the geopolitical chessboard gets incredibly dark and incredibly dangerous. The naval blockade officially commenced on Monday, April 13th at exactly 10 o'clock in the morning Eastern Time. That is right now. At this very second, heavily armed United States Navy guided missile destroyers, deploying highly trained visit, board, search, and seizure tactical teams on fast interceptor boats, are actively holding positions in and around the dark waters of the strait, aggressively enforcing the commander-in-chief's order. The single question that is keeping military strategists awake in Washington, London, and Beijing is whether the Iranian military will actually respond with kinetic force. We know that Iran has already seeded the strait with hundreds of highly explosive naval contact mines. We know that their conventional blue water navy was largely destroyed in the initial American air campaign, but the Revolutionary Guard still retains a massive, highly lethal capability to launch asymmetrical swarm attacks. Fleets of heavily armed fiberglass speedboats, thousands of low-flying suicide drones, and hidden coastal anti-ship cruise missile batteries carved into the Zagros Mountains all pose an incredibly severe, lethal threat to the American warships and any commercial vessels brave enough to enter the kill zone. Furthermore, Iran does not fight alone. They have heavily armed proxy allies scattered across the region. The Houthi militant forces in Yemen currently control the heights overlooking the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, which is the other major critical choke point for global oil shipping entering the Red Sea. If the Houthis decide to aggressively close that secondary strait in synchronized retaliation, global energy analysts have stated that the price of oil could easily and instantly surge well above $150 per barrel, completely shattering the global economy. There is also the massive looming shadow of the China factor. The People's Republic of China buys approximately 90% of all of Iran's illicit oil exports. Chinese commercial supertankers have been among the very few international vessels explicitly allowed to safely transit the strait under secret bilateral deals with Tehran. If the United States Navy actually begins physically boarding and interdicting Chinese-flagged vessels on the open ocean, it immediately creates a whole new terrifying level of superpower confrontation. We are no longer just talking about a regional conflict. We are talking about the world's two largest nuclear-armed economies potentially engaging in a direct naval standoff over intercepted oil shipments. And hovering above all of this tactical chaos is the terrifying, unresolved nuclear question. Remember, the marathon diplomatic talks in Islamabad failed specifically because the Iranian regime absolutely refused to surrender its nuclear enrichment program. Tehran continues to insist, despite all international evidence to the contrary, that its highly advanced nuclear activities are strictly for civilian energy purposes. But the United States military and intelligence apparatus does not believe a single word of that argument. Major intelligence leaks have indicated that the American administration is actively considering resuming limited, highly precise military bunker-buster strikes against the Iranian mainland in a desperate, violent attempt to break the diplomatic stalemate. If those stealth bombers are launched, the fragile temporary ceasefire that has been holding the region together for the past 2 weeks would be instantly vaporized, and we would be immediately plunged back into a full-scale, devastating, multi-domain war. The American leadership seems to genuinely believe that applying absolute, suffocating maximum pressure will eventually force the Iranian regime to capitulate. They have stated repeatedly that the Iranian conventional military is effectively destroyed, that their navy is currently rusting at the bottom of the Gulf, and that Tehran literally has no other choice but to unconditionally accept the American terms of surrender. But the supreme leadership in Iran is showing absolutely zero signs of backing down. Their parliament members are standing on the floor of their assembly stating publicly and defiantly that the strait will remain closed. Their military commanders are continuously broadcasting warnings of immediate, harsh, and fiery responses to any approach by American warships. This is the definition of a classic hyper-lethal geopolitical standoff. Both sides firmly believe they hold the ultimate leverage. Both sides firmly believe the other side will eventually blink first under the pressure. And the rest of the civilian world is caught right in the middle of the crossfire, helplessly watching their national economies deteriorate day by day, while two heavily armed governments play an incredibly dangerous, high-stakes game of nuclear chicken. The coming days and hours are going to be absolutely critical to the survival of the modern world order. You need to watch the global oil markets closely. You need to watch for any sudden, violent military incidents or boarding actions in the Strait. You need to watch for any frantic diplomatic signals or back-channel communications from either side. This is one of those rare, terrifying moments in human history where the rapid, high-stress decisions of a few isolated leaders sitting in a few heavily guarded capital cities will directly determine the economic fate and physical survival of billions of people across the globe. The Strait of Hormuz is only 21 miles wide. But right now, as the American destroyers lock their weapons systems and the Iranian missile batteries power on their targeting radars, that tiny stretch of water might as well be the absolute center of the universe.